All right. So I wanted to talk about the show that I should have been covering for like a while, but never got a chance to do it, even though I've been keeping tabs on it. And it's Godfather of Harlem. Now, before I even like talk about like the show or anything, I just wanted to give y'all like maybe a bit of a backstory of like the origins, the slight origins of like Bumpy Johnson and the things that they didn't really talk too much about the show. Now, I get it because they're taking bits and pieces of what actually happened, and they kind of like throwing it all together, almost like how BMF is doing with the story with like Big Meech, where they taking some stuff that's true and some stuff that's not really true, and they just putting it all together in the show. But with like Bumpy Johnson and the story of what they're telling, and for the Godfather of Harlem, with him going back and forth with the Italians, and him trying to like protect Harlem, but then at the same time he's kind of like a hero to Harlem, and he's sort of like a devil to Harlem, because it's like he's supplying everybody with like drugs and narcotics and all that other stuff, but at the same time he's also helping them by giving them like turkeys and giving them money for the things that they need to sending their kids to school, right? And that's some of the things that the actual Bumpy Johnson actually did, where he did send some kids to though he did put kids through school, right? But at the same time, he was selling drugs, and that kind of was like the whole angel and devil face that he essentially had. But the one thing I'm not quite sure that the show actually talked about was Bumpy Johnson's mentor, which is basically Stephanie St. Clair. Because Stephanie St. Clair, she was his mentor, and she was the first one. She was basically like the queen pin of Harlem, you can say, because she was also responsible for like racketeering, right? And I believe money laundering, drug trafficking, basically illegal stuff that she was doing with the banking, gambling, right? She was that woman. She was doing like a lot of corrupted things, but she was nonetheless part of the whole racketeering business. But Bumpy Johnson was her lieutenant. He was her lieutenant, but then after, when things started to like change in that time, in that era, that period, that's when she left. And then that's when she gave everything over to Bumpy Johnson. The almost the exact same way of Al Capone's mentor, because Al Capone's boss slash mentor, basically, I think, what was his name? I forgot his name, but he basically gave everything over to Al Capone once when he decided to leave. And he was just like, you know what, I'm essentially done, and I'm gonna give everything over to you. And that's when Al Capone took over Chicago. So it was essentially the same way with Stephanie St. Clair, what she did to Bumpy Johnson, and then Bumpy Johnson took over, and that's when he was in charge of things. But the one thing that the show kind of didn't really explain as well, because even though, yeah, we love Bumpy Johnson in the show, and he's outsmarting the Italians, he's doing this and that or whatever, the actual Bumpy Johnson didn't really do that. It was more of a, they was all they was all working together. They was coexisting together, and they was working together of selling drugs. And Bumpy Johnson had Harlem, and then the Italians had Brooklyn. They had parts of Manhattan. Like, they was all spread out. They was essentially all spread out. And Chinchigante, what they showed, where they explained in the show, where he was pretending that he had a mental illness. That was true. That part was true, where he was in the bathrobe peeing on himself, shaking and shit. That was true. That was true. So they took bits and pieces of it. But I guess the whole Chinchigante and Bumpy Johnson, being cool, or Chinchigante was Bumpy Johnson's drive. That wasn't true. That part wasn't really true. Now, in season 4, they're explaining about, like, I guess Frank Lucas is coming into the fray. Now, from what I remember, like the story, like between like Frank Lucas and Bumpy Johnson, I believe it had like Frank Lucas. I believe he was on the run, because I think he had a bounty on his head or some shit. And I think Bumpy Johnson either paid off the bounty or he did something. But I know he was able to get like Frank Lucas under his wing. And that's where Frank Lucas was Bumpy Johnson's essential driver. But I know when it comes down to Frank Lucas's story, it's kind of like misconstrued, because Mamie Johnson said Frank Lucas never really knew Bumpy Johnson. He never really worked with him. But then Frank Lucas at the time, he explained that, well, he's not going to say anything bad about Mamie, but he did work with Bumpy Johnson. So there was plenty of interviews in the past going back and forth, like, okay, did Frank Lucas really work with Bumpy Johnson, or did he not work with Bumpy Johnson? And was it just he just said all these things just to, put himself in that category of he was working with Bumpy Johnson? But nonetheless, there was a movie about him, if everybody remember the American Gangster movie, where they showed a little bit, like they showed a snippet of Bumpy Johnson, where he was his essential mentor and his teacher, and then that's when Bumpy Johnson died. But the way how Bumpy Johnson died, in reality, nobody killed him, but he basically had like a heart attack because he was at his what was it? He was at a restaurant and he was, I guess, having breakfast or something, and that's when he had a cardiac arrest and he died. And he passed away, I believe this was either 1964 or 1965. That's when Bumpy Johnson actually died, around those times. Because in the story, in the last season, they showed that how Malcolm X basically died. Now that part was accurate, how somebody came on stage with a sawed-off shotgun and they shot him in the chest. Even though I was really pissed off about that when I was watching, I was like, man, that was some bullshit. Because if he was alive today, things would have been well, not today, but well, maybe, who knows? But if he would have been alive much longer, I think today's society would have been a lot different. And I'm saying that more in the black community side. I think things would have been a lot different. Maybe more eyes would have been on certain things, but I digress. But that part was essentially true. Now, Bumpy Johnson's daughter, and the whole Malcolm X thing, I don't believe that was true at all. No. Again, that was just stuff that they put into the story, and also the beef between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X was true too, because it was more of a, he's trying to speak out and say what's right, but then Elijah Muhammad's like, no, you need to tone that down a bit. So that was essentially true. That's why it even sparked rumors and curiosity that maybe essentially Elijah Muhammad had Malcolm X killed. That was the rumors back in the days, what we all was hearing. But all of the stuff that they're actually telling is slightly true, and most of it is not really true. But Bumpy Johnson was technically the Godfather of Harlem, and he did do half the things. Well, if not all the things, but half the things that we've seen in the show. But him outsmarting the Italians, no. Even though we like that, but it's just like, no, he didn't really do half of that. And him being with Mamie Johnson, that's true. He been with her, yes. That's essentially true. And yeah, it's most of the things that they told in this show, like I said, half is true and half isn't true. But I'm not quite sure if they really did talk about like Stephanie Sinclair, because I would have preferred it if they would have talked maybe just a bit about her, because I believe in the first season they showed that, okay, Bumpy Johnson spent 10 years in Alcatraz, and then he came out, and then he's essentially trying to reclaim what's rightfully his. And that's when he was like, oh, I'm going to take back Harlem, I'm going to rebuild my community, right? And he's going to make everything right. So, yeah, from 1952 to 1963, that he spent 15 years in Alcatraz, which is pretty long for his time, but he actually did do that for conspiracy of drug trafficking and stuff. But yeah, it would have been funny if he would have met Al Capone there, but Al Capone was there a lot earlier before he was there, but still cool nonetheless. The whole story with Bumpy Johnson actually knowing Malcolm X, that's true. That's true, because we heard stories about, I guess, them two essentially knowing each other. Because keep in mind, the story, like let's just say like 1960, because Malcolm X was around like in the 60s before he passed away, and he was walking around in Harlem, like he was around in the Harlem area. So the chances of him meeting Bumpy Johnson would have been essentially high. It would have been essentially high, because back then it was about, racism and black people trying to get rights. They're trying to like, make it in life, but you have like, white people still being racist, people oppressing them, right? All of that is still essentially part of the whole story. So it made sense in the grand scheme of things. But the five families on its own, it's like, it's the five families is the five families. But again, they work with Bumpy Johnson back in the days, but you can say they never really liked it him, because again they was like Italian, mafioso, the familia, right? They never really liked it, Bumpy Johnson. They just worked with him because it was like, okay, he's basically the black man of Harlem. He has those people under control. We have ours, and we just gonna do business, and we're gonna move weight and sell drugs together. But we know back in the days, there was talks about like the FBI maybe essentially looking at Bumpy Johnson and was gonna probably, bring him in, but then he had a cardiac arrest and he passed away. So, like I said, nothing really happened to Bumpy Johnson. Like nobody killed him, none of that. He just died of natural causes, essentially, right? So, that's why I think when they do decide to give us like the season finale of Godfather of Harlem, I think that's what's gonna happen. Like he's gonna be his favorite diner or restaurant or whatever you call it, and he's having his breakfast, but then he catches he catches a heart attack and he dies, and that's essentially what happens to like Bumpy Johnson. Now, if they wanted to spice it up, they could, because if anybody remembers like Boardwalk of Empire, the real, because his name was, I believe, Enoch Johnson, but they called them Nucky. I think it was a Thompson or Johnson. I think no Thompson. I think Johnson. I think Nucky Johnson. But the real Nucky Johnson, he didn't die. How they explained it in the show, he essentially lived, and that was it. Like he didn't. Nothing happened to him, so he lived. But in the show, they was like, oh, he gets killed off by, I think, James Doherty's son. I forgot his name, but his name was James something. But I know his son kills him. But that didn't really happen in real life. So, like I said before, there's some things that they taken out of context, and they essentially try to make it into a story. But yeah, that's like a little bit of the story of, the real like Bumpy Johnson and the things that they actually told in the show, because we do know there's actually like a documentary of like Bumpy Johnson, and the thing is, it's like his story wasn't fully fleshed out and it wasn't really told, because yeah, we got the show and then we got the documentary, but he's one of the people that was never fully brought up and talked about. It was more like he was a forgotten person, because they talked about everybody of the Nick Barnes, the Al Capones, the five families, what's his face, Gotti, right? They talked about all of these people, but Bumpy Johnson, they never fully talked about him. Like he was never really in the conversations, but he should be, and he is in the conversations of being the Godfather of Harlem, a gangster, a criminal. Like he was all of that, right? He was all of that. But again, it's great that we have season 4. I can't wait to see what they're gonna tell in the story, because I've seen the trailer. Frank Lucas is now appearing into the show, and he's getting office to take out Bumpy Johnson or whatever. So I can't wait to see it. But let me know in the comment section down below of what do you guys think about Bumpy Johnson and the story of Godfather of Harlem, and how it's really good for them to explain more about like characters and people that should really be talked about in history, not just forgotten about and just like, oh, he wasn't really important. So I do like that. And also too, if you like me maybe covering like maybe more topics like this, in the future. But we just testing some things out and seeing we could do what we could do. But as always, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And I catch you all in the next one.